Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. I never saw myself as a suspicious person. In the early 2000s, my life felt straightforward. A steady job in marketing, a part-time working wife named Karen, and two young children, Emily and Noah, ages 4 and 6. Our days were governed by simple routines. Breakfast at 7, preschool drop-off by 9, pasture green lunches in the backyard, and bedtime stories at 8. Karen's decision to work part-time meant that Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday were her office days, while Monday and Friday she stayed home with the kids. I trusted her implicitly. One late spring morning, around 9 o'clock, I heard the front door click behind me as Karen slipped out to her parents' house, just as she did most weekdays. The kids waved goodbye at the entryway window, and I waved back, before settling into my home office. It occurred to me only hours later, when I drove through town on my way to an appointment, that a trip to her parents required a 90-minute commute each way. Twice a week made sense. 3 times was unusual. 4 or 5 days felt excessive. At first I chalked it up to our families leaning in to help. Motherhood was demanding, and Karen's neighborhood friends often praised her courage for juggling toddlers and preschoolers. But then I noticed the odometer on her Mazda creeping up at an alarming rate. The small digital display showed she'd logged roughly 400 extra miles on her weekly commute, enough for 4 return trips to her parents. I lay in bed that night, the ceiling fan whirring above, and did the math. Those miles didn't include her commute to work, her grocery runs, or any family visits on weekends. Something didn't add up.
The next morning, before dawn, I retrieved my notebook from the bedside table. By candlelight, I sketched a mileage log template. Date, starting odometer, ending odometer, total miles. I left it open on the kitchen counter, half hoping she'd ask what I was doing. She never did. Instead, I filled in the numbers day by day, squirreling away the little sketchbook in my briefcase. My suspicion grew slowly, like a weed winding through cracks in the pavement. I found evidence of a long lunch break, sandwich wrappers in the glove compartment from a cafe neither of us frequented, receipts with odd initials scribbled on the back, MP or DJ. I spotted a faded lipstick stain on the driver's side window, though I knew she rarely wore that shade when the kids were in the car. Each clue felt minor alone, but together they formed a mosaic of contradictions. When I pushed the topic, Karen brushed me off with clipped excuses. "Your math must be off," she insisted, voice tight. "It's just extra errands." Her gaze flickered away, and her face paled ever so slightly. I pressed further. Have you been stopping by the hardware store? You've driven past it twice this week." She laughed, too loudly. "Just helping Dad hang some shelves?" I wanted to believe her. I wanted to see her smiling face and brush aside the nagging doubts. Yet the knot in my chest tightened.
Rather than confront her again, I turned inward. I remembered nights when she returned home with an unfamiliar scent. Cologne, musk, something distinctly masculine. I remembered glimpsing her on the phone, pressing it to her ear with a secretive posture. I remembered the time our daughter, Emily, sang a little rhyme about Grandma's house 2 towns over, crediting Mike for giving her extra cookies. Mike was Grandma's cat, or so I thought. Now I wondered if Mike was more than a metaphor. In late June, I resolved to gather proof before accusing her. The kids' summer break was a perfect cover. They often stayed with grandparents during the day, so Karen could pick up extra shifts at her job. I slipped a small GPS tracker under her car's rear bumper while she chatted with me in the driveway. As she closed the door, I tossed the tracker into the trunk and orchestrated an errand run that conveniently let me watch her drive off. That evening, I downloaded the tracker data onto my laptop. The map line didn't lead to Grandma's house. Instead, it stopped at a drab motel off Highway 54, then lingered for 2 hours before returning home. I printed screen captures of the map and the exact times, 10:15 a.m. to 12:30 p.m., Tuesday through Thursday, for the past 3 weeks. My hands trembled as I read the numbers. The world I built, of faith, of shared responsibility, of marital trust, cracked around me. The tipping point arrived one steamy July afternoon. I was working late on a presentation when the kids burst into the home office breathless. Emily clutched your drawings, and Noah held up a magnifying glass. "Daddy, look what Grandma's friend gave me," Emily said, her voice bright. I knelt and took the drawing. A crude caricature of me in a suit and tie, standing beside a woman holding his hand. "Who's she?" I asked. She giggled. "Auntie Lissa. She stayed at Grandma's house, too." Lissa. The name struck me like a punch. Lissa was the woman at the motel. I recognized her name from the sweaty receipt I'd found weeks earlier. My world spun. I sat on the edge of my chair, heart pounding. The kids' innocent revelations, the mileage logs, the GPS data, all pointed to a betrayal so brazen it made my head swim. The pain was electric, expectant. I locked my office door, sat at the desk, and stared out at the night sky as if it might swallow me whole. I didn't sleep. Instead, I wrestled with the moral weight of what I'd uncovered. The woman I loved was unfaithful, taking our children to her parents' home as cover for her own affair. I recalled my parents' bitter divorce, years of resentment, broken promises, and stolen childhoods. I vowed then that I would not let history repeat itself. I would not bury this truth. I would set a path forward guided by cold facts rather than hunches. A week later, I decided to dig deeper. I thought of asking her to explain the motel visits, but I feared her denials and my inability to refute them. Then I spotted the sticky note on her AOL computer, a password in her cramped handwriting. It sat atop a stack of papers as innocently as a bookmark. I stared at it for an hour, mind leaping between guilt and necessity. Finally, I memorized it, replaced the note, and prepared myself for the next step, logging into her email to find incontrovertible proof.
In the dim glow of our dining room lamp, I sat at the computer and entered a password. The screen filled with subject lines, promotions from discount stores, newsletters from parenting sites, and then one that made my chest seize. Our lunch plan? I clicked it, and the content spelled out the betrayal. Messages between Karen and an ex-boyfriend from high school, arranging midday meetings, laughing about unspoken details, mocking his wife. I scrolled until my fingers ached, printed out several pages, and tucked them into an expanding file folder on the floor. In that silent room, surrounded by evidence, I realized I stood at a crossroads. The life I'd built, one of partnership, of mutual respect, of shared dreams, was no longer mine to roam freely. I had to decide whether to confront her next morning or gather more proof before shattering the illusion. The flickering lamp cast long shadows on the walls, as though urging me onward. I closed the laptop and exhaled, steeling myself for the journey ahead. The morning light slanted across my kitchen table, illuminating a yellowing sticky note stuck beside the keyboard of our old AOL desktop. I had never been the husband who snooped. My moral compass had always pointed toward privacy and trust. But something deep inside me recoiled whenever I thought of Karen's furtive trips and my children's odd recountings of Grandma's house visits. Seeing that note, completely exposed, felt like an invitation I could not refuse. I sat down heavily in the cracked vinyl chair and stared at the note for what felt like hours. Her password, simple, her own name plus a string of numbers she'd chosen by tossing dice, glared back at me. My heart thudded. I pressed my palms flat to the cool surface of the table, worried my fingers would tremble and reveal my uncertainty. Why had she written it there? Carelessness mixed with contempt, as though she was daring me to look. When I finally raised my hand, each keystroke seemed to echo in the silent kitchen. The screen glowed to life, and my eyes drank in the familiar AOL interface. I scrolled through her folders, inbox, sent, drafts, and then a folder titled Old College. My pulse spiked. The cursor hovered, then clicked. Message after message unfolded, exchanges between Karen and her college best friend, Sarah. They were arranged chronologically, a private archive of confidences. At first, the topics were innocuous: campus gossip, job frustrations, toddler tantrums. Then, in midsummer entries, the tone shifted. Under subjects like lunch plan or yesterday, I read words that struck me like shards of glass. He's waiting at that seedy motel. I needed to feel wanted. And Jessica is pathetically fat now. Can you believe she actually thought marrying him would make her happy? My world blurred. I leaned back so hard in the chair that I nearly toppled. The air felt thin. My breath came in shallow gasps. Images of those motel visits, the extra miles, the lipstick stains, they snapped into focus now with full horror. I closed my eyes and pressed my head against the back of the chair. A cold sweat trickled down my spine. I scrolled deeper, printing out every exchange that mentioned the ex-boyfriend, his first name, the locations, the mockery of his wife. I watched the pages crawl out of our inkjet printer in a steady, relentless stream. When I had 5 pages of damning evidence, I stacked them on the table and ran hot water for coffee. My hand shook so badly that I spilled grounds on the counter.
The coffee's bitter aroma mingled with the metallic sting of betrayal. I poured the steaming liquid into my favorite mug, once a gift from Karen, and brought it back to the table. With trembling hands, I picked up the first sheet. There it was, a typed confession of her midday rendezvous at Motel 7, dated July 12th. The next page chronicled their mensch at the diner. The next, the crude jokes at her ex's wife's expense. I slumped in the chair, drinking coffee as though it might dull the pain. I felt my chest tighten into a vice. Every sip burned like acid. Tears welled in my eyes. Shame for having doubted my own instincts for so long. Anger at her deception. Grief for the family I thought we were. My reflection in the blank computer monitor stared back at me, hollow and unfamiliar. A voice in my head whispered that this was enough proof. I could march into our bedroom, throw the papers on the bed, and demand answers. But another voice, colder, more rational, warned against a hasty confrontation. If I acted on suspicion before gathering all the facts, I risked allowing her to gaslight me again. I needed more evidence before I shattered our life. I stared at the stack of prints and ran a hand through my hair. The morning sun had climbed higher, but I barely noticed. I thought of my children playing quietly in the next room. How would they react if they heard me accuse their mother? How would I protect them from the chaos that would follow? The ethical line between exposing truth and inflicting collateral damage blurred. I pushed away from the table and paced the kitchen, coffee in hand. My notebook lay open, the mileage log spread across the counter like a road map of her betrayals. I realized that digital snooping had given me clarity, but not the full picture. I still did not know the identity of the man who had replaced me in her heart, or the pattern of her movements beyond those email timestamps. That afternoon, I called my old friend Mark, the police detective who had once mentored me. His voice was calm but concerned as I explained the situation in broad strokes. No specifics, but enough to trigger his professional instincts. "If you think she's meeting someone," he said, "you're going to need an objective observer. I know a good PI who left the force 2 years ago. Ron's methodical. He won't steer you wrong." Within an hour, I had Ron's number. I explained my reluctance to drag in more people, worried about violating privacy and creating a spectacle. Ron assured me his work would be discreet and thorough. GPS surveillance, time-stamped photographs, a written report of every meeting. He emphasized that once we had undeniable proof, I could proceed without ambiguity. That evening, I delivered a sheaf of printed emails, mileage logs, and motel receipts to Ron's unmarked car in my driveway. He opened his trunk, lined with surveillance equipment, cameras, and an extra GPS device. He tipped his hat and said, "I'll handle it from here. You'll have a report in 10 days. As he drove off, I stood in the driveway, coffee still in hand, feeling as though I was dispatching a part of my own soul. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, a simultaneous explosion of deceit, the crumbling of a 20-year history of love, the shockwaves through our kids' lives. I returned inside and cleared the printed pages from the kitchen table, shoving them into a locked drawer. I scanned the room, looking for traces of normalcy. Our wedding photo on the mantel, the finger paintings in the hallway, the happy chaos of a family home. The walls seemed to press in, heavy with anticipation. That night I lay awake in the dark, listening to the soft snores from the bedroom next door. My heart hammered against my ribs. I thought about Karen's betrayal rolling in under the cover of grandparent visits, the ease with which she hid behind our children's routines. I thought about my own cover as a loving husband, the blind trust I had worn like a badge.
The next morning, I poured coffee and slid into my leather chair at the kitchen table. On the computer screen, the AOL login prompt flickered, but I no longer needed to log in. I had contacted a professional who would document every rendezvous, every greasy motel parking lot, every secret exchange. The truth would surface in a detailed report, bullet-pointed and photograph-rich. As I sipped my coffee that second day, I felt an odd mixture of relief and dread. The sticky note had unlocked a trove of hidden messages, and my next step would unlock even more. Soon I would hold the unassailable proof I needed to confront her, protect my children, and decide whether any trace of our marriage could survive this avalanche of lies. When Ron arrived at my house, he carried a leather briefcase that seemed too small for the weight of what I'd asked him to gather. Standing in the driveway, I handed over the sheaf of printed emails, the mileage logs I'd kept for weeks, and the GPS tracker I'd slipped under Karen's bumper. He listened without interruption, eyes steady and professional, as I outlined the motel address, the approximate lunch hours, and whatever scraps of information I had about the man she was seeing. Then he nodded, closed the case, and slipped quietly into his unmarked sedan without a backward glance.
For 10 days, I moved through my routine with the feeling of a man on hold. Each morning, I checked my phone before the sun rose, hopeful for a text from Ron marking the report's completion. At work, I answered questions in meetings with polite nods, though my mind raced through snippets of motel parking lots and midday encounters. At home, I poured coffee into a chipped mug and stared at the front door, waiting for the low rumble of someone arriving with information that would change everything. On the 11th day, the doorbell rang just as I sat down to dinner with the kids. I excused myself, my stomach tightening in anticipation. I found Ron on the front porch, a tan manila envelope tucked under his arm, a stack of glossy photographs peeking from the open mouth of his briefcase. He handed me the envelope without fuss or pleasantries. "It's all here," he said quietly, his voice as steady as the click of the door closing behind me. I retreated to the living room, closed the blinds, and laid out a blue tarp across the coffee table to protect the wood from spilled ink and coffee drips. Then I emptied the envelope and briefcase onto the tarp. A single report bounded in a heavy 3-ring binder sat at the center, marked with a bold label, Private Investigation Report, Confidential. Around it lay a stack of photographs, color-printed maps with highlighted routes, and a folder of supplemental documents.
I opened the binder and found a professional, tabbed layout: executive summary, surveillance logs, photographic evidence, GPS data analysis, subject background information, conclusions, and recommendations. I flipped through the summary, which restated what I already knew, but in legalese that felt cold and objective. It outlined the scope of the investigation: confirmation of repeated visits to Motel 7 between 10 a.m. and 12:30 p.m. on weekdays she had claimed to be with her parents, lunch dates at the diner across town, sequences of travel matching the odometer logs. It concluded that these were undisputed acts of infidelity and recommended that I consult legal counsel for divorce proceedings. Next, I turned to the surveillance logs. Each entry read like a police report. July 8, 2003, 9:45 a.m., GPS tracker confirms vehicle departs home address. 10:10 a.m., vehicle enters Motel 7 parking lot, observed by agent number 1. 10:15 a.m., Karen emerges from backseat of sedan carrying tote bag, crosses behind building to side entrance. 10:20 a.m., male subject's vehicle arrives, subjects enter room 102. 12:25 p.m., both subjects exit, exchange a quick embrace, she retrieves tote bag. 12:30 p.m., vehicle departs for home. I ran a finger down the page, the repetition of dates and times turning accusation into fact. Each line felt like a stab, precise, unemotional, undeniable. The reports continued for 3 weeks straight, Tuesday through Thursday, detailing the same pattern of behavior. After the logs came the photographs. They were meticulously labeled: date, time, camera angle, agent number. I watched Karen approach the side door of Motel 7, her hair pulled back in the same ponytail she wore on daycare drop-off days. I saw the man, Bob, emerge from a dark sedan, suit jacket draped over his arm, phone pressed to his ear. I saw them enter the room together, his hand briefly at the small of her back. I saw them emerge hours later, her eyes averted, his gaze fixed on the exit sign overhead. The images were grainy but unmistakable.
My breath caught as I examined a photo dated July 15th, Karen wearing a pale blouse, clutching a plaid tote bag that our daughter had once used for library books. The outrage that rose in my chest was matched only by a grim relief. At least I had what I needed: evidence, clarity, a path forward. I flipped through the GPS data analysis. Color-coded lines traced a curve from home to Motel 7, then a jagged path to the diner on July 16th, where they had met for a burger and fries at 11:45 a.m. The report even included time-stamped credit card charges: $8.45 at the diner's register, $2.50 for the motel key. Ron had cross-referenced receipts, GPS pings, and surveillance photos to build a synchronized timeline of the affair.
The level of detail was chilling. The subject background section profiled Bob. The dossier contained public records, marriage certificate, property deeds in his father-in-law's name, articles from trade magazines praising him as a rising star in sales. He was a VP of sales at his in-laws' manufacturing firm, married to a woman named Linda with 3 young children. His life was a mirror of my own: suburban stability, career ambition, family commitments, an image of respectability shattered by his midday detours. When I reached the conclusions page, I set the binder aside. Ron's language was carefully neutral, offering recommendations rather than verdicts. He advised I meet with an attorney to explore my rights regarding divorce, child custody, and asset division. He noted that while infidelity does not affect custody in our state, it could influence spousal support claims and the emotional well-being of the children. I closed the binder, feeling the final ring click shut like the verdict of a judge. The photographs lay strewn around it, silent witnesses to the truth I'd long suspected. My fingers traced the edge of a photo of Bob holding Motel 7 keycard 102 against his palm, his face half hidden in shadow. The shock that had frozen me at first snapped into determination. I would not let this betrayal go unanswered. For hours afterward, I sat in that dimly lit living room, the binder on my lap, staring down at the evidence. My thoughts spiraled through the coming decisions: confronting Karen, hiring a lawyer, planning for the children's futures. I thought of the night she'd returned home, fresh from those motels, kissing our kids on the forehead, tucking them into bed while I worked late. I thought of the commitment I had made at the altar, the promises of fidelity I'd taken and shattered by doubting her too late. At some point, I fell asleep in the leather armchair, the report still open on my chest. I woke before dawn, stiff and achy but clear. I packed the binder into its envelope and loaded it into my car. I drove to the office of a divorce attorney I had researched weeks earlier, someone with a reputation for handling high-conflict cases with empathy for children. I parked in a side lot, entered the firm's foyer, and asked to speak with the attorney. Inside her office, I laid the folder on her desk. She opened it, studied the contents, and said quietly, "This is comprehensive." She outlined the steps: filing a petition for dissolution, arranging temporary custody orders, preparing financial disclosures. Her calm efficiency felt like a lifeline. For the first time, I felt the momentum of action rather than the weight of suspicion. After our meeting, I asked the attorney to draft the necessary paperwork. I paused as she typed, contemplating the gravity of what I was doing. The evidence wasn't just proof of her affair. It was the severing of the life we had built. It was an admission that our children's world would change irreversibly. Yet I had promised myself I would protect them from my parents' mistakes. I would act with integrity even as I dissolved my own marriage. That evening, I returned home with the initial divorce petition in an unsealed envelope. I placed it on the kitchen counter next to my children's artwork and yesterday's coffee cup. Upstairs, I heard the soft breathing of 2 children asleep, unaware of the storm gathering around them. I sat at the table, folded my hands, and studied the floor plan of my life's next chapter. The morning I served those papers at Karen's workplace, I felt a stillness unlike any I'd known. The binder of Ron's report sat beside me in the passenger seat, ready to be shared if needed, yet I hoped not to use it. My aim was not revenge, but resolution, to end the deception and allow us all to rebuild, she with the consequences of her choices, and I with the safety of knowing where truth at last lay. The morning I pulled into Karen's office parking lot, light rain misted the windshield and my stomach churned with the gravity of what I was about to do. In the passenger seat lay the divorce petition drafted by my attorney. Clear-cut grounds, child custody proposals, requests for alimony and asset division. Beside it, in a sealed envelope, rested Ron's meticulously compiled binder, photographs of Motel 7, surveillance logs, credit card receipts, evidence so irrefutable it would leave no room for denials. I sat in the driver's seat for longer than I cared to admit, hands wrapped around the steering wheel, heart pounding with fear and relief. The weight of my parents' bitter divorce decades earlier echoed in my mind, how betrayal had poisoned every corner of our childhood. I vowed I would not let that history repeat itself for Emily and Noah. When Karen's building came into view, a brick facade with frosted glass windows, I took a slow, steadying breath. I reminded myself this was not vengeance. It was accountability. I retrieved the petition from its envelope, felt the crisp paper under my fingertips, and walked inside the lobby. Receptionist whispers and curious glances followed me as I signed in for a personal document service. 15 minutes later, an assistant escorted me to Karen's floor. I waited outside her office, listening to the muffled hum of phones and hushed conversations. My pulse rattled my ears until the door opened and she stepped into the hallway. Her eyes widened, confusion registering before recognition flickered. I offered the papers without a word. She snatched them, glanced at the cover page, then looked up at me, an unreadable expression masking guilt and defiance. Without a single syllable, she turned on her heel and re-entered her office, slamming the door behind her. Leaving her building felt surreal, as though I were shedding a skin that no longer fit. I drove straight to the courthouse with the petition, filing it in a sterile office buzzing with other broken marriages. The clerk's stamp echoed like a verdict, divorce proceedings officially underway. I collected the stamped copies, then returned home to formulate the next step. The binder of evidence remained unopened on my desk. I had one final request for Ron. Identify Bob's wife and deliver every shred of proof to her. She deserved to know the truth about her husband's betrayal. Ron and I met briefly in my driveway the next morning. He unloaded updated surveillance data, his earlier report of Karen's infidelity, plus new findings on Bob's routines, family details, and home address. As casually as we might discuss tailing a paper delivery, he told me he had confirmed Bob's wife was Linda, mother of 3, living in a modest suburban home purchased in her parents' name. She'd never suspected an affair. I handed him a second copy of the binder, fresh labels marking private and confidential for spouse only, and asked him to handle the meeting personally. Ron promised discretion and scheduled a meeting that afternoon at Linda's workplace. I spent the afternoon pacing my living room, imagining the shock that would ripple through Bob's household. The children's laughter from the next room sounded like an innocent counterpoint to the deception unfolding across town. My phone buzzed at last with a text from Ron. Met with her. She saw it all. Wept. Going to act. Those words hit me like a punch, vindication mingled with guilt. I realized I had no control over how Linda would respond, whether she would forgive Bob, press charges, or collapse under the betrayal. All I knew was that I had provided the truth, and whatever followed lay in her hands. Within days, public filings confirmed what Ron had warned. Linda had emptied her joint bank account, secured an emergency protective order, and moved the children to her parents' house out of state. Bob, stripped of accounts and custody, faced a divorce petition from Linda accusing him of wanton infidelity and emotional cruelty. His father-in-law, furious at the stain on his business, immediately terminated Bob's VP position in the family company. Without income and house ownership, Bob found himself evicted and adrift. Service notices and eviction orders crossed my desk as attachments in news alerts about a high-profile family feud. The fallout grew uglier as court documents trickled in. Linda's divorce filing described months of controlled surveillance she'd conducted in secret. Her heartbreak laid bare in sworn affidavits. She demanded full custody, restitution for emotional distress, and punitive damages. Bob responded with countersuits, accusing her of alienating his children and of overreaching contempt motions. The court transcripts told of courtroom drama, accusations hurled, contempt charges, and a restraining order after an incident at Linda's new residence in which Bob allegedly pursued her beyond agreed boundaries. Local media outlets picked up the story of VP's double life and ran features on the downfall of a trusted executive caught in a midsummer motel affair. Online forums buzzed with commentary on infidelity and punishment, as though Bob's humiliation was public entertainment. I watched headlines scroll on my phone with a conflicting sense of satisfaction and horror. His wrecked career and broken family had nothing to do with me, yet I had set it in motion. Justice or vengeance, the line felt impossibly thin.
Through it all, I thought of my own children and the lesson they were learning. Betrayal cut deep, leaving scars beyond repair. I took solace in knowing their mother would now face consequences and perhaps be deterred from further deceptions. I arranged for a counselor to visit our home, ensuring Emily and Noah had a neutral adult to talk with about the whirlwind of changes. Their questions were simple but piercing. Why did Mommy lie? Where is our sister? Linda packed photo albums of Bob and the kids to take with her. I answered with gentle truths, mindful not to malign Bob's wife as my move, but to emphasize that honesty and family safety were paramount. In the aftermath, I reflected on the power I'd wielded by exposing both betrayals. Bob's life lay in shards across court filings, his children's lives uprooted. Karen's face had turned pale when she realized the legal proceedings had begun. My parents' divorce had taught me the pain of parental betrayal, and I vowed to protect my children from repeating that cycle.
Yet witnessing the collateral damage to Bob's family made me wonder if I'd overstepped, not out of malice, but out of a desire to safeguard my own family. As Bob's name disappeared from company records and local directories, I found myself at a moral crossroads. The cold facts had defended my children and dissolved my marriage, but at what cost? I paused, thinking of my own vows: fidelity, partnership, mutual respect. In dissolving someone else's marriage as retribution for my own spouse's infidelity, had I honored those vows or betrayed them in kind? I realized then that justice, though necessary, exacted a toll on every life it touched. In the quiet weeks that followed, I kept the divorce proceedings focused on custody arrangements and financial fairness, refusing to gloat or seek punitive damages. I granted Karen reasonable visitation and encouraged her to seek therapy, hoping to restore stability for our children. In my own work and personal life, I rededicated myself to integrity and transparency, mindful that my actions had far-reaching consequences. When the dust settled, Bob's family fractured beyond repair. Karen's path forward remained uncertain, and my own family reshaped around new boundaries. Yet, out of the wreckage, I found clarity. Truth, however painful, is the foundation of any real relationship. Deception only perpetuates suffering, no matter the justification. In exposing infidelity, I had protected my children and reclaimed their safety, but I also witnessed how swiftly lives can unravel when trust is broken. As I closed that chapter, I resolved to build my future on honesty, no matter how unpalatable the truth might be. The day the final decree of divorce arrived in the mail, the judge's signature felt like both an ending and a beginning. I held the crisp paper in my hands, its legal language precise and impersonal. Dissolution of marriage, joint custody of Emily and Noah, division of assets. There was no mention of infidelity, surveillance reports, or motel rendezvous. Those details were for lawyers and private files. The court cared only about custody schedules, support payments, and marital property. I tucked the decree into a leather binder alongside Ron's report, a silent testament to the truth I had fought so hard to expose. In the weeks that followed, our house felt simultaneously empty and full. I repainted the children's bedrooms in softer hues, sage and sky blue, in part to erase the lingering shadows of betrayal, and in part to signal a fresh start. Emily, now 12, approached the change with the quiet maturity of a child who had seen too much. Noah, 10, complained about the paint smell and longed for video game hours. We rebuilt routines: Saturday morning pancakes, weekday homework sessions, library trips after school. Karen's visitation days were clearly marked on our shared calendar, but otherwise our interactions were strictly about logistical handoffs. I never pressed her for explanations or apologies. The evidence was silent, the divorce decree spoke for itself. The transition from a two-parent household to co-parenting under one roof demanded honesty with the children. One evening, while I drove Emily and Noah to soccer practice, they both asked why their mother had moved out. I told them, in age-appropriate terms, that sometimes adults make choices that hurt the people they love, and that their mother and I were learning new ways to parent separately. I emphasized that neither of them was to blame, that we both loved them fiercely, and that they could ask me any question, always. Their relief at hearing me say, "I'm here for you, always," was tangible. A reminder that my responsibility as a father now outweighed every other concern. As our family rhythm reestablished itself, I found space to reflect on the fallout in Bob's life. Although I had no personal stake in his divorce, his unraveling had felt like an echo of my own trauma. The local headlines had followed VP's double life as it bled from one news cycle to the next. Linda's empty bank account, her emotional affidavit, Bob's countersuits, the restraining orders, the broken nose he'd earned from his brother-in-law. Eventually, the story faded from public view, replaced by news scandals and elections. But in private, Bob's reputation remained in tatters. A year later, I discovered through a mutual acquaintance that he had left the state, taken a lower-level sales position under an assumed name, and avoided all social media presence. To my knowledge, he had not reconnected with his children, and Linda had moved on within her family's business network. I sometimes wondered if I had crossed a line in exposing him. My attorney had assured me that sharing evidence with his wife was morally defensible, that she deserved the same knowledge I had sought. But watching the collateral damage spread beyond my own home gave me pause. I carried that moral complexity with me like a weight in my coat pocket, the knowledge that truth can save some and destroy others. In the nights following Linda's confrontation, I found myself revisiting every choice, each step from the sticky note to Ron's final report, and asking if any action had been too harsh. In those moments, I reminded myself that I had fought to protect my children and to uphold my own integrity. The collateral damage was an uncomfortable but unavoidable consequence. In the months after everything settled, I turned inward once again. Divorce had been a rupture that left me vulnerable, but it was also a portal to self-discovery. I revisited the therapy practice I had reluctantly started before my marriage ended, and I committed once more to weekly sessions with Dr. Patel, a counselor specializing in family trauma. We unpacked the residual anger I felt toward Karen's deception, the guilt I carried for doubting my instincts until I had proof, and the shame I wrestled with over dragging multiple families into the fallout. I learned to transform that raw emotion into compassion for myself, for my ex, and even for Bob and Linda. Compassion did not excuse their mistakes or mine, but it allowed me to release the heavy burden of resentment. At work, I found purpose in mentoring younger colleagues. I shared lessons from my own life about communication, boundary setting, and ethical decision-making. I led workshops on work-life balance, drawing on my experiences as a divorced parent juggling deadlines and school pickups. My career, previously just a means to an income, became a vessel for meaning. I discovered that guiding others out of their own professional entanglements gave me a renewed sense of value beyond marital roles. On weekends, when the children were with Karen, I explored life beyond parenthood. I took up trail running to clear my mind, signing up for my first 10-mile race the following spring. I visited art galleries and bookstores, rekindling the curiosity I had shelved during the darkest days of suspicion. I reconnected with friends I had neglected. Some offers of companionship I had once declined in my tunnel vision chase for Karen's forgiveness. Through these friendships, I found laughter that felt untainted and easy, a balm for time spent swimming upstream through lies and half-truths. The passage of time brought new milestones for Emily and Noah: middle school plays, soccer championships, science fair awards. Each success reminded me of the family I had fought to sustain, even as the foundation shifted beneath us. Watching them grow, confident, curious, and resilient, filled me with a pride that no trial could erase. I realized that divorce had not defined me as a failure, but rather as a father committed to ensuring their well-being above all else. 3 years post-divorce, I received an unexpected email, a short note from Linda, Bob's ex. She wrote that she had found a measure of peace after rebuilding her life, thanked me for respecting her privacy once the initial shock wore off, and wished me well in my journey. She attached a photo of herself and her children at a beach, smiling broadly. In that moment, I felt the last stitch of resentment unravel. My role as the catalyst in their story had concluded, and I could finally let go without guilt. Later that year, I accompanied my children on their first father-daughter, father-son weekend camping trip. We pitched tents under a canopy of stars, cooked hot dogs over the fire, and told stories in whispers before sleep claimed us. Emily confided in me that she had dreamed of her mother's laughter in the night, and Noah asked if we could spend every weekend together. I promised them consistency, that our tradition would stand no matter what changes life brought. One crisp autumn morning, as I zipped up my running jacket and stepped outside, I realized I had almost forgotten how to dread the sound of rain on the windshield. Instead, I felt anticipation for my run down the leaf-strewn trail. My divorce papers lay in a cabinet. Ron's private investigator's report lay in another. Both were relics of a life that had cracked open and closed again. Now, with each breath of cool air, I sensed possibility, untethered from betrayal, anchored instead by the surety that truth, however painful, leads to freedom. Looking ahead, I drafted a personal mission statement in my journal: to live transparently, to nurture the trust of those I loved, and to guide my children into a world where they could believe in honesty without fear. I set goals to write a memoir of my experience, in case my children or others might benefit from the lessons of my journey. I plan to volunteer with organizations supporting families through divorce, offering counsel born from lived experience rather than textbooks. In the end, the story of my marriage's collapse and my wife's infidelity was not the whole story of my life. It was a chapter that taught me the cost of deception, the power of evidence, and the necessity of compassion. It led to 2 families in ruins and 2 new ones beginning to rebuild. Mine focused on co-parenting with respect, theirs on a fresh start beyond scandal. The echoes of motel corridors and hidden emails receded over time, replaced by the laughter of my children, the camaraderie of friends, and the quiet confidence that I had navigated the hardest path I could imagine. And so I stand at this threshold, no longer tethered to shadows of betrayal, but stepping into a future defined by resilience. I have learned that truth need not be wielded as a weapon, but embraced as an essential foundation for living. On that foundation, I build each new day, determined that honesty will guide me, and that the miles of deceit I once recorded will remain only as a reminder of how far I have come. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear from you what moment in your life made you see someone for who they truly were. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to Reddit Whispers, where the real stories get told.